Okay, everyone, welcome to your Unit 2 AP Macro Review. On this review, we're going to be covering the stuff that we've covered in the later half of our macroeconomics class. We're just going to focus mostly on monetary policy. So most of it's on monetary policy and the Fed. There'll be some comparisons to fiscal policy, so it's not a bad idea to review that if you don't know it. There'll be a few little economics philosophy things in there, and I'll touch on that quick too. But don't forget about things like how the Fed can also change the money market, and how the money market can change loanable funds, and how the loanable funds market can influence aggregate demand and just aggregate demand. And in the long run, aggregate supply, actually. Also, we're going to be covering our Phillips curves as well as our production output. So those things usually pretty simple. And the last thing that'll be on it is going to be exchange rates. Keep in mind, foreign trade and exchange rates will be on this exam as well. So that's what this exam primarily focuses on. There will be stuff from earlier as well, but a small amount, and I hope you guys already know and understand that. All right, first thing we should know about as we look at our aggregate supply and aggregate demand model is if we're talking about classical economists. We all know we have our new Keynesian, and new Keynesian would go ahead and look at a model, and this model would look very similar to what we're looking at here. Which means that if the government goes ahead and wants to influence the economy, can they with a Keynesian model? And the answer to that is clearly yes. As in, he cares a lot about that short run. But classical economists have a bit of a different idea. They're going to go ahead and say that, no, we're normally at long-run aggregate supply. And in fact, the best way for the market to fix a problem is to simply let what fix the market? The market fix itself. Use self-correcting ideas. So if we had a big supply shift like this, we know that that would increase employment, so unemployment would decrease. As unemployment decreases, wages would start to increase, and increase in wages causes short-run aggregate supply to do what? Move back until we get to our long-run aggregate supply. Okay, other things to know is the Fed. So the Fed, we need to make sure we know our 3 steps here. Okay, so when we talk about the Fed, we need to know that what is one way that they can influence the money supply? Well, the first one we'll always cover is reserve requirement. The reserve requirement is how much banks need to do what? Keep in their reserves. So if a depositor puts money in, they have to keep a certain amount in reserves. And because of that, that influences the reserve requirement, influences the 2 words. First one starts with an M. The second word is an M. The money multiplier, okay? Which means, remember, banks create money. As they go ahead and take your $100 and they hold on to 10 and loan out 90, well, that's a new $90 that has entered the economy, which then someone else takes that 90 and they spend it, someone puts it in the bank and they loan out the 81, and they've added more money. So remember, that money multiplier does take into effect with the reserve requirement. So a big reserve requirement would do what to that multiplier? It would reduce it, which means we'd have less money. And a smaller reserve requirement would do what to the money multiplier? Increase it. Therefore, you would end up with more money. Okay? Now, the problem with that is the required reserves a bank keeps also dictates its stability, which means a small reserve requirement would cause banks to be what? Less stable. And a large reserve requirement would make them more stable, but much less what's that? Profitable. They'd have less money to loan out. They'd have to hold on to too much. So the Fed usually sets a reserve requirement, and do they use it very often? No, they do not. Remember, banks' reserves that are not required reserves are called what? Excess reserves. And what can the bank do with those at whim? Loan them out. All right, the next one here is what? The key one that you really need to know. Very good. That's going to be our open market operations. And open market operations, is the key to it is the buying and selling of bonds. Very good. So remember, always try to track where the money's going. If the Fed is buying bonds, that means the bonds are going where? If the Fed buys bonds, the bonds go to the Fed, and therefore where does the money go? Into the economy, and that would be what kind of policy? Expansionary policy. Very good. Okay? Now, if the Fed sells bonds, that means where are the bonds going? They go out into the economy and to the banks. Where does the money go? To the Fed, and that would be what kind of policy? Contractionary. And we all recall that with the money market, the money supply dictates what?
Investment.
Well, interest rates. And interest rates dictate investment spending. Very good. Okay? So, do you guys remember that, or do I need to go over it? All right. And here, I'll go over it in a moment, but let's go to the third thing that the Fed does. What's the third thing? That's right. They have the discount window, or the discount rate. Now, this is the rate that the Federal Reserve will do what? Well, they can change it, and they can change it through in relation to open market operations as well. But the discount rate is the amount that the Federal Reserve will do what? Loan out money to who? Other banks. Can you get a loan at the Federal Reserve? No, but how much they'll loan out to banks? Remember, if banks fall short of their reserve requirement, they need to get a what by the end of the day, or they're breaking the law? A loan to fill that hole. So as the bank goes ahead and gets a loan, they can go to the Fed. And if the Fed's offering a interest rate on that loan at 6%, what would other banks likely do? Give a lower interest rate. Because they need to undercut the Fed. Because if they can't undercut the Fed, where would you get your loan from? The Fed. So the other banks will undercut that rate. And these are for short-term loans, more between banks. And what do we call the rate that banks are exchanging money between each other? What's that? Very good. So the discount rate leads to the federal funds rate. And the federal funds rate is the price that the interest rate that banks lend to each other. It's different from the discount. The discount rate, throw my U in there. And it's different from that because it should be lower. If the discount rate is ever lower than the federal funds rate, that means where are banks getting their money from? What? No, if the discount rate is lower than the funds rate, they're getting it from the Fed. And that's usually Fed's now just trying to pump lots of money. That would be a very bad situation. The discount rate would have to be very, very low. Okay, so now we understand that. We should know that by the way, if the discount rate and the federal funds rate is very low, that would mean banks would be what? What would they do? They'd want to borrow money. They're getting cheap money, so they'd borrow more. If banks borrow more money, that means they have more money to do what? Loan out, and that will increase. What would that increase? The money supply. Very good. However, if the discount rate is very high and the federal funds rate is very high, that means banks, would they want to get loans to shore up their reserve requirement? No, they wouldn't. So what would they do? They would get, a high discount rate and a high federal funds rate would make banks do what? They wouldn't get loans, and if banks aren't getting loans, they don't have money, or as much money, so therefore they'd loan out less, and there'd be less money in the economy, and the money supply would decrease. So you guys understand how all of these things work and work together? Okay, so let's go ahead and make sure that we understand the transition between all these graphs. So you guys probably remember this one a little bit, whether you like it or not. And we know that this first graph here is what? Right, this is going to be the money market, okay? It's a market for money. What is this graph right here? Right, this is going to be the market for investment spending. Really, it's a market for loanable funds as well. So this would be investment. And this is our aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph that you guys should be very, 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 very comfortable with. And if you're not, go look over your stuff. Okay, so we know that if the Fed, well, here, why doesn't someone pick something that the Fed does? Someone have an option. Here, Austin, tell me something that the Fed does with the money supply, open market operations. Increase something, decrease something. What do they do? Increase supply. All right, well, give me an action. I'm sorry, that would be a better word. What's an action that the Fed takes? Just make one up.
Bonds.
Okay, the Fed engages in open market operations. They buy bonds. That means where are the bonds going? The bonds go to the Fed. Where does the money go? It goes into the economy. That is going to move what? The what? The supply of money. So it's going to move the money supply. So our money supply increases. Okay, what are the effects of the money supply increasing? Well, here's our new equilibrium quantity. And our interest rate has now decreased. And remember, on our FRQs, we want to show in symbol, interest rates have decreased. Write it out, interest rates decrease. However, how does this interest rate affect investment?
Spending increases.
That's right. In the market, now we have a lower interest rate, which means if a business or a bank or someone wants to get a loan, they could pay what?
Less.
A lower interest rate. A lower interest rate. Remember, the interest rate is the price of money. So a lower interest rate means money is cheaper. And if things are cheaper, people will demand more. So now there will be new investment spending. So here's our new investment equilibrium, which means investment spending has increased. Or consumers could take certain loans where the interest rate matters. What does it mean if we have more investment spending? Investment, remember our CIG, X minus M. What is that equation? Very good. That is the equation for real GDP. So that means real GDP has increased. Now, what on this graph is going to move because of that? Aggregate demand. People will demand more goods. Because of this investment, people are going to demand more goods. Does monetary supply, or does monetary policy do anything with supply? Remember, if the Fed puts more money in the economy, does that produce anything? No, but it will make people demand more goods. So instead of our equilibrium, which was right here, we can call this one our PL1. Where's our new equilibrium? It's going to be up here, so we call this YE1. And we know that this has caused the economy to what? Grow. What are some of the effects? GDP increases in the short run. What are some other effects? Unemployment decreases. Very good. What are some other effects? There's going to be inflation, especially when the market self-corrects. Okay? So if we were here, you would say all of a sudden a new Fed chairman comes, and the new Fed chairman's going to engage in, I don't know, what kind of policy, Taylor? If this is our situation. Contractionary policy. So what action would they take to make contractionary policy? Okay, if the Fed sells bonds, where do the bonds go?
To the economy.
And to the economy, where does the money go?
To the Fed.
To the Fed. And if the Fed has money, then where's the money?
Not in the economy.
Yeah, it's not being spent by anyone. So that would cause the money supply to do what? Decrease. That means we're back on this interest rate, and therefore we're back to here. And that would cause what to move? Money supply. Monetary and fiscal policy always moves what? demand. Now, there's one little catch. Sometimes if you increase investment spending, that means firms are buying what? Capital goods. And if firms increase capital goods, if we remember our production curve, that means firms can supply more goods. And that could move what in the long run? So it can, in theory, move supply. But keep this in mind. In the long run, typically aggregate supply or short-run aggregate supply would move backwards because of high prices and inflation. People would expect more inflation, and therefore, in the long run, monetary policy really creates what? What really move supply and produce more goods in the long run? The answer is typically not. But look for those curveball questions about an increase in investment can cause a longer increase in supply. By the way, one other problem, if we did fiscal policy, we could skip a lot of the money market. Oh, by the way, what situation would monetary policy not work at all? What? Supply shocks it can, but you have to make the choice. Do you want to get rid of inflation, or do you want a recession? So it can work, just you get two bad options. You have to pick one. Paul Volcker, he fixed inflation in about 81, 82, but made a big recession in the process. What if there's a really bad recession and you get to a liquidity trap or deflation? If there's deflation, that means if you hold on to money, what occurs? If there's deflation. Deflation, just holding on to money makes you wealthier. Which means if I'm the Fed and I'm trying to get rid of that deflation by giving money into the economy, so I start giving banks and firms money, you have money, and what do you do with it? You hold on to it, because what are you getting by holding on to it? More money. Because is anyone going to offer a negative interest rate? Am I going to pay you to take my money? So a liquidity trap makes monetary policy ineffective. Okay? Which means you'd want to shift to what? Fiscal policy. All right, guys. Good luck, and focus on some crowding out problems. We've already gone over that, but that's fiscal policy related. Good luck.